Hi, I'm Shannon Gunn Emery, and welcome to Legal Eyes. Now, you may be saying, wait a minute, wasn't this Adventures in Law and Life? Ah, good catch. Well, now it's Legal Eyes. If you have to blame somebody, blame my son who didn't like the first title, and our friend Dave, who came up with a better one. They were both right. I promise I won't change the name every single episode, but the new name just fits. For the most part, I'll be talking about issues or stories, but from the perspective of a lawyer. For example, the next episode, not this one, is going to be about sex work. I promise you, it's going to be eye-opening. Today's episode, though, is more on the adventure and life side. I hope you enjoy it. I can't speak for all lawyers, but I can say that the lawyers at Gunn Law Group travel a lot. So far, I have not pled cases in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or Nunavut. So if you are charged in one of those jurisdictions, please call me. I really want to go. Now, you might ask yourself, why would someone in Nova Scotia hire a lawyer in Alberta? Well, why do the oil companies here in Alberta hire people from Newfoundland? Why would anybody in Newfoundland want to go all the way to Alberta? You may say it's supply and demand, but I think it goes further than that. Our world seems smaller, or more intimate, or more accessible. I don't know how you want to call it, but if you are charged with impaired driving and you want me, I will be there wherever you are. Criminal law in particular allows for that because criminal law is based on the criminal code. The criminal code is federal. So if you skipped across the country committing offenses everywhere you went, the same offense, for the purposes of this hypothetical, you should be treated more or less the same way in every place you go. However, beware, my serial crime committer, that every place interprets the code a little differently. In fact, sometimes there was just a different legal culture. I remember my first case in Calgary. Calgary is about 3.5 hours away from Edmonton. Getting there was its own ordeal. Way back when there was no GPS, I'm sure any children listening must be puzzled. What on earth would you have done without GPS? How would you get anywhere? Maps, my dear children. Horrible, terrible maps that never worked and never got you to where you wanted to go. They were particularly tricky if you were directionally challenged. I sometimes fell into that category. So, with very little help from those horrible maps, I found the courthouse, made my way inside, found my client, sat down, and was ready for trial. When the judge walked in, he looked at me. No, he glared at me and said, "I assume you want to make an application to have your client sit beside you?" Oops, we don't do that in Edmonton. Our clients always sit beside us at counsel table. We never have to ask. But it was clear we had to do that in Calgary. So I made the application and, granted. I could see we were off to a great start. Once I had a case out in British Columbia. It seemed to me things really were going well there. At one point, we took a little break. A lawyer came up to me and looked at me rather dismissively and said, "You must be from Alberta." I was a little taken aback. I said, "Yes, how did you know?" "We don't call the judges sir here. It's always your honor. Only lawyers from Alberta come in here saying sir." And he walked away. Okay, good to know. Within Alberta, most of the places that I went to, I got to by car. I loved driving. It was very enjoyable. I'd listen to audiobooks, a little like how you're listening to this podcast right now. One time, I was driving back from a trial in Peace River when I saw something on the road. It looked like a skunk, and so I thought, well, I'll just avoid it. It was unfortunately in the middle of the road, so I positioned my tires on either side and drove over it. But when I looked back, it looked like it was moving, and I felt horrible. I just couldn't stand the idea of that poor animal suffering. So I pulled over to the side of the road and walked back, fully intending to put that poor animal out of its misery. I didn't know how, but I would have to do something. However, when I approached, I saw it wasn't a skunk at all. It was a kitten, a very small kitten, and a very much alive kitten. I was so glad now that I had stopped and walked back because now I could save the kitten. But the kitten was not in the, "oh, thank goodness someone came along" frame of mind. No, that kitten was seriously ticked off, really mad. I had seen another vehicle go over it too, same way I had, wheels on either side. That kitten had had a really bad day. It hissed at me, swatted at me. It was putting up such a fight. But I can be stubborn too. You know how people say that owners are a lot like their dogs? Well, I have a Shiba Inu. If you know the breed, you know. They are very stubborn. I know just what my Kenzo would do. He would declare it his. Everything in the whole world is his, and then just grab it. After a few more tries, I was able to scoop him up. I looked over the kitten, and he looked fine. It was like a miracle. He didn't seem sore, he wasn't bleeding, he didn't seem to have a scratch on him. Maybe there is something to those 9 lives. This poor guy definitely used up 2. I put the little scrapper on the passenger seat beside me and drove off. At one point I had to stop for gas. I went inside to pay. When I came back, I couldn't find the kitten. I searched everywhere. I didn't know where it went. I was pretty sure it hadn't slipped out the door. And then I heard a meowing sound. And I swear it came from the engine compartment. That kitten was somehow inside the inner workings of the vehicle, which are a huge mystery to me to begin with, but now I had no idea what to do. I hurried back to the gas station and explained my plight to the very kind gentleman who listened to me. He came over to the vehicle. He opened the passenger side door, and reaching underneath and behind the glove compartment, he pulled the kitten back down. There was a horrible meowing sound. I was very grateful. I don't think the kitten was. We continued on our way, and when we got back to Edmonton, I had no intention of keeping this kitten. Student Legal Services, which was at the time located in the same building as ours, ended up adopting her. I think Charlotte was very grateful at that point, and she lived happily ever after with Student Legal Services. Charlotte was a very pleasant surprise, especially compared to the one that awaited me in the next adventure. I was thrilled when a client hired me for a case in Prince Edward Island. It's my favorite place. I am a huge fan of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I like everything Prince Edward Island. Or, actually, I later discovered almost everything in Prince Edward Island. I was almost disappointed when the Crown prosecutor withdrew the charges the moment I walked into the courtroom. I was really looking forward to that trial. But a win is a win, and it left me with a whole extra day to do exploring. I rented a bicycle, packed it into the little rental car, and went out in search of a very interesting ride. It definitely wasn't boring. I found the spot, parked, got my gear out, and took a look around. It was a wooded area and the middle of a workday. I was sure it would be a peaceful, quiet ride. There was a little map at the outset, and I figured out exactly where I wanted to go and was just getting ready to pedal off when a young man approached me. He was on a bike too, and he asked, "Can you help me?" Now, I am not the most observant person. I have learned that about myself. My husband put flowers on my pillow one day. I just walked right by, didn't notice a thing. Poor guy. I hope Dale never starts his own podcast. So looking with my non-observant eyes at this young man, I didn't see why he needed any help. He was on a bicycle. It was a nice day. He didn't sound like he was injured or in pain. So I asked him, "How can I help you?" He just kind of looked at me and repeated, "Can you help me?" I was getting a little frustrated and I wanted to get cycling. "I don't understand. What do you need help with?" Finally, he said again, "Can you help me?" And he pointed down. I looked down and saw that he was exposed from the waist down and in a state of some excitement. I thought it would be better that I leave immediately. I snapped my eyes back up to his face and said very quickly, "No, I can't help you with that," and cycled off. I will admit that rattled me a little. After a few minutes, I glanced back. Yep, he was following me. Oh boy. I sped up. When I want to, or apparently when I'm being followed by a flasher, I can go pretty fast. I looked back again and was relieved to see I had lost him. I debated internally what to do from there. I could go back to the parking lot, but he might be there. There was nobody around. I really did want to go for this bike ride, but I also didn't really want to be in the middle of the woods with some guy who needed help that I was not prepared to give. I decided I would not let this wreck a beautiful ride. Focus on the positive. I'm by myself now. Everything's fine. He's gone, and it's a beautiful day, and I have come a long way to go for a bike ride. And it was very beautiful. Unfortunately, though, just as I rounded a corner, there he was again. This time, he had dismounted from his bike and was standing on the side of the path, again, pretty much the way I saw him the first time, maybe a little more excited. And he again yelled out to me, "Can you help me?" It's one of those cases where you have a split-second decision to make. I already had momentum and was traveling towards him quite quickly. Did I want to stop and turn around? I was a little bit nervous that if I stopped, he could take that as encouragement or try to attack me. So I decided to accelerate and go past him. So I gunned it and kept going. By this time, try as I might to focus on the positive, the charm of that ride was broken, and now I was frankly fearful for my safety. So I headed back to the parking lot, packed up my bike, and called the police because this was a very concerning incident. The policeman I spoke to asked me, "Oh, yes, I see. Was it an older gentleman in around his late 40s in a white car?" And I said, "No, it was a young guy, probably around 18, on a bicycle in an orange shirt." And then I thought to myself, how many flashers do they have in PEI? Well, he took down my statement, and I never heard anything else. Now, please, dear listeners, do not be dissuaded from going to PEI. It is a magical, wonderful place, and I am sure they have their flasher problem well in hand by now. My visits to Newfoundland did not have any flashers. An amazing snowstorm, the likes of which I have rarely seen, but no flashers. My trial was to take place in a little town called Port-au-Choix. Beautiful place. I rented a car and drove up there. It was the first time I had ever been in Newfoundland. I fell in love with it. As I was traveling, the hills, the water, the trees, the rock, there was something about it that called to me. As I was driving, I couldn't help but notice the names of the places. there are some very interesting names. First, I was surprised how many French places there were. If you look on a map, you can see Fleur de Lys, Fermeuse, Point-la-Haye, Beaubois, and of course, the stunning Gros Morne. Then there were some cases that were like a combination of French and English, L'Anse-aux-Meadows. And I think Newfoundland takes the cake for imaginative names, such as Twillingate. I love the name Twillingate. Gander, Tickle Harbour, Blow Me Down Provincial Park, Nippers Harbour. But then as I was traveling north of Port-au-Choix, I noticed different names that suggested that whoever was doing the naming was getting a little tired, like Bird Cove, Pond Cove, Black Duck Cove. Okay, it sounds like they maybe were rallying at that point, but there is a Black Duck Brook south of there. Dead Man's Cove. Okay, now we are getting somewhere, although there is a Dead Man's Bay on the opposite side of the island. And then Nameless Cove. Okay, that's where they went, we give up. This is too much. No more. Nameless Cove it is. But of all the places that I have traveled to as a lawyer, I have to say the North has probably touched me the most. And when I say the North, I mean Northwest Territories and Yukon because, as you know, I'm still waiting to go to Nunavut. I used to do circuits with legal aid in Northwest Territories. Those circuits took me in very interesting places. Toledo and Delaney. One time when we were in Delaney, there was a little community lunch. 2 young men who were having hot dogs asked to do a selfie with me. Visitors were something of a rarity. I said yes. We all smiled into the camera together. The North is really different. People are very interdependent and they know it. We take for granted sometimes in other places how much we need each other, how much we need the farmers, the truck drivers, the teachers, the nurses, and yes, dear listeners, sometimes we even need lawyers. On the few occasions where I would rent a car in the Northwest Territories and drive somewhere, I was often struck by how few cars there were. I kept thinking, if I hit a buffalo, I could be sitting here waiting for a very long time before anybody happened along. The only good thing is that if someone did pass by and notice I needed help, I had quite a bit of faith that they wouldn't just keep going, but they would stop and help. I remember one time we were flying into Hay River. I was chatting with a guy I'm going to call Freddie. He was a very friendly kind of sort. When the plane landed, I noticed that there was an elderly gentleman, I'm going to call him Jack, who was struggling with a very large piece of carry-on luggage. I asked him if he would like me to take that for him, and he said yes. It did occur to me that Jack was a very trusting sort. Here I am just walking off the plane with his luggage, but he didn't seem to have any concerns. When we got into the airport, Jack asked me if I had a ride to the hotel. I said no. Now that was not my first trip to Hay River, and I knew that the cab company, such as it was at the time, was not very reliable. I think it was just a guy who, when he had time, he would give you a ride, but he was so busy or he was asleep, I don't know which, you could be waiting for a very, very long time before you got a cab to anywhere you wanted to go. So I said no, with somewhat of a hopeful look. He offered me a ride to the hotel, and I said yes. Now, dear listener, if that had been Edmonton, that would have been a hard no. But things are different in the North, and I did have the thought that I could probably outrun him. I asked Jack, would it be okay if Freddie also came along? Freddie looked up gleefully. Jack looked disdainfully at Freddie. Oh, Really? Jack looked at me. You're serious? You want Freddie to come along? I said, yes, I think he is going to the same hotel and it would be really nice. Fine. Freddie, you can come. Freddie was gleeful. He was almost cackling. And Jack just grumbled as he put us both in the back of his van that had no seats in it, by the way, but it was a ride, and I was grateful. I will never forget going to Ulukaktok. It used to be called Holman Island. It's on the western tip of nowhere. It's far, far north. It was winter. The sky was a solid bank of white clouds. There was not a spot of blue anywhere in the sky. There was snow on the ground, lots of snow. All of a sudden, I had this strange feeling. Have you ever seen those pictures where the backdrop chosen is just all white? Well, that's kind of how this felt. It was like being dropped into an all-white universe where you couldn't tell where top or bottom or up and down was. There were no trees. There were no rocks. There was nothing. It was flat and white on the ground and white on the sky. And when I stepped out of the plane, I wondered if I was going to fall over. It was very disorienting, but it was also awesome. And I mean awesome in the way that awesome is supposed to be meant, not like awesome. No, I mean it fills you with awe. It fills you with wonder. You land there and you realize you're in a very different place than you have ever been before. Practicing law there was different too. In remote communities like Ulukaktok, court took place in a little community hall. We would all go in. The court party would start setting up tables and chairs to get ready. When people heard the plane come in, they started making their way to the little community hall. Some were there because they were accused of offenses, others were there to support loved ones, and others were just there for the entertainment. On a cold winter day, when there's not much else to do, court can be fairly entertaining. It also had the advantage of being warm inside. Just as court was about to begin, the outside door cracked open, and a man slipped inside. I will never forget him. He was shivering. He only had on like a little summer jacket. It had been reinforced to me as I was preparing for this trip that if I did not have snow pants and a very warm jacket on, I would not even be allowed to board the plane. It was a liability issue because it's cold up there. The man I saw slip into the courtroom that day had experienced the bite of the cold. He was bleeding. I don't remember exactly where from. I just remember a lot of blood. His hands looked swollen, like they had been frostbitten. And I realized I had never had to struggle just to survive. I hadn't gone through anything like this man had clearly gone through. I would do what I could to help him that day, but I knew his struggles weren't over. People in the North face many challenges. Life isn't easy. I remember one day, Peter Hart, a very capable lawyer in Yellowknife, and I were on circuit. It was not unusual to have two defense lawyers on circuit. One would handle what we call docket, which is adjournments, pleas, very quick court appearances, and the other would handle the trial matters. That day, it was decided that I would do the trials and Peter Hart would do the docket. That arrangement did not suit everyone. I had a client whose trial was scheduled for that day. I must explain, it was often the case that I would not have met my client until the day in court. In fact, sometimes I didn't even get the file until the day before. So the lawyer-client relationship was to be developed on the spot. So I spoke to my client and got the distinct impression we were not off to a good start. He made it very clear. He wanted Peter Hart. He did not want me. I explained that this was the arrangement, that it had already been decided, but he was very mistrustful. It was clear from the look on his face, not so much from his words, that he didn't think I was going to be able to do anything to help him. If I had been in Edmonton, I would have simply indicated to the court that I was not able to assist this person, as we did not have a solicitor-client relationship at all. But this was the North. If I did that, he would simply have to come back another day. So, while normally I would not represent somebody who does not want me to represent them, I kind of pushed a little, and he grudgingly accepted. We ran the trial, and he just looked surprised when we won. Not even grateful or happy, just shocked. It was all a little insulting, actually. There were no profuse thanks. There was just a little glance, a very slight smile, a nod of the head, and he was gone. But somehow I felt his thanks. I will never forget the first time I went to Fort Smith. I walked in the courthouse, and the first thing I saw, hanging on the wall, was a picture of Judge Wendon. Now, Judge Wendon was a judge from Edmonton. I knew him quite well. He loved French trials. So do I. As I stepped farther into the courthouse, I realized there were pictures all around the walls, and all of a sudden, a gentleman almost grabbed me by the arm and said, "Oh, are you new here?" I guess, yes, I am new. I've never been here before. "Oh, are you a lawyer or a crown prosecutor or a judge?" "Yes, a lawyer." "Okay, come with me." And he dragged me back outside. He explained as we went that he took pictures of all lawyers, judges, and crown prosecutors who went through Fort Smith and had been doing so for years. He took a picture of me. I remember I was wearing a red coat. It must have been quite the contrast against the white snow. I'm guessing that if you go to Fort Smith, you will see it somewhere on the wall. Every time I went to the Northwest Territories, I would bring food, because you never know what could happen. In court, one does not always get breaks when one would like them. The judge decides when we're going to have lunch or if we're going to have lunch. And in some places, the possibilities of getting food were limited to none. So along with the required snow pants and a very good jacket, I brought food, nuts, granola bars, chocolate, or any of the snacks that they were serving on the plane. You know those won't go bad. I think they're made to last for hundreds of years. Not a super appetizing thought, but when you're hungry, those pretzels and cookies look pretty good. One time, an officer fainted on the stand, right in the middle of his testimony. Yep, just went down. My first aid training is not great, but I had lots of chocolate in my briefcase and we just stuffed it into his mouth and he revived. When you travel that much, you have to be careful about time zones. So, for example, if I had a case in Saskatchewan, I always had to make sure, what time is it in Saskatchewan? One of the few points where Alberta and Saskatchewan do not agree is on daylight savings. One time, I had a case in Peace River. Now, Peace River is in Alberta, and so I didn't have to worry about the time zone, but apparently I should have been more concerned about being really certain as to when trial started. If you've never been to Peace River, let me tell you, it is pretty. Lots of trees, and that day it was a beautiful morning. I decided to take advantage of all that sunshine and fresh air. I decided to go for a little run. Later, my client said that he and his friend were sitting in a restaurant. He was looking out the window while they were eating their breakfast and happened to say to his friend, I think that's my lawyer that just went running by." It was. I had a lovely time. Until I got to the courthouse, and the first thing that the sheriff said is, "They're looking for you in courtroom 1. "Why?" "Well, court started a half hour ago." My heart dropped. I was mortified. I ran up the stairs. By the time I got to the courtroom, I was out of breath, and I had a prickly judge. When I walked in, ran in, I just knew he was furious with me. I apologized profusely and sincerely. I was really sorry. I always try to make sure I'm early for court, never late. And eventually, we started the trial. Hour after hour went by, and I started to be concerned. I had a flight to catch to go back to Edmonton that day. Pretty soon, I realized I was running out of time. I really only needed about, you guessed it, a half hour more. I said, "The irony is not lost on me, sir." "I know, sir," because we're in Alberta. The judge gave me a look and said, "Yes, this is all your fault. We wouldn't be in this position if you had arrived on time. But I've called a taxi, and they're waiting for you downstairs. Finish your submissions, and then off you go." Turns out, even prickly judges have a heart. To an outsider, a courtroom may look like a cold, unfriendly place. Sometimes it is. But looking at it through these eyes, these legal eyes, we see flashes of who we are as a society and a community. Shannon Gunn Emery, signing off.